Welcome back to Monitoring Clinical Trials. My name is Steve Pope, and this week we're going to be talking about organizing your work as a CRA or as a monitor. So let's first talk about our purpose, and this comes from ICH E6R2 section 5.18.4, which are monitors' responsibilities. We've gone through this earlier in our course, so I'm not going to list out all those things. But to kind of get us started, the monitor, in accordance with sponsors' requirements, should ensure that the trial is conducted and documented properly by carrying out the following activities when relevant and necessary to the trial and the trial site. So what that means, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to have to travel out to the site. So a lot of what I'm going to go over here are just some basic understanding and some tips on how to keep yourself organized, because you've got a lot of moving parts, a lot of changes to your schedule. Sometimes they can get a bit chaotic, and it's important to stay on top of those. And so you kind of need to be aware of what can occur and sort of how you can avoid getting behind schedule on certain things. Our learning objectives include discuss the road life of a monitor, cite the workload requirements for CRAs, discuss how to prepare for your visits, and identify and prioritize administrative tasks. So I'm going to go over each of these and give you some background and some tips and information on how you can stay on top of these things that will make your life a little bit easier once you get into that monitoring role. So your life on the road as a monitor can be somewhat hectic. So traveling is just an essential part of monitoring because you have to go out to the sites. That involves traveling, could be air travel, could be driving. You may have some sites that are local to your area that you don't have to stay in a hotel overnight, that you can just drive to, and it's great if you have a few that are like that. But in most cases, you're going to be traveling, fairly heavily, probably every week, to some site that you're going to be monitoring. So it's important that you keep up, and in order to succeed at keeping up, you've got to be able to do the following things. The first thing that I recommend is to develop your organizational skills. That means keeping yourself organized if you're working out of your home, if you're working out of an office. Also, keeping yourself organized when you're actually traveling. So I'm a big believer in using Outlook reminders to keep yourself on track about due dates and things like that. We have quite a few office productivity tools that are available to you. I recommend that you create an Excel spreadsheet that maybe you keep track of when you send confirmation letters, keep track of your IMV visits, when you've done your trip reports, your expense reports, things like that. It's also important to plan your schedule in advance. The further out you can plan for your visits and also for your office time is very beneficial, because then you've got a schedule that you can easily, or at least more easily, keep up with. Plan your paid time off. Plan your vacation time as far in advance as possible, and go ahead and get that on the schedule and get that notification sent out to your team so that it's on their schedule as well. That helps you when you're creating or when you're scheduling your monitoring visits, that you don't schedule a monitoring visit, at least initially, on a week that you might be taking vacation. So plan that out as far in advance as you can. Create a routine. This is very important. I like to create travel routines that are specific to a site that you're going to. For example, if you've got several sites in multiple cities, you're going to be traveling back to those cities on a regular basis. Scope out what the flight schedule looks like and which ones are best for you to take advantage of, and then plan to book those flights each time. And that includes coming and going. After a while, you'll get a pretty good handle on the flight schedules. You'll know whether or not you're connecting through one city versus another city, what kind of conflicts or potential conflicts there might be in doing that. So that can help you as you go along. I usually like to try and stay in the same hotel in each city that I go to. I tend to eat at the same restaurants a lot of times, and of course I try and pick the same flight schedules as much as I can. Another thing to do that I think sometimes gets lost, as it's more difficult to do, is it's important that you're eating healthy when you're out on the road. You'll develop a routine for doing that. And I also think it's very important that you exercise. Every place that you're going to go is going to have an exercise room. Get into the habit of doing that. I like to do that each morning. That way you get it out of the way. You're kind of done with that for the day. But developing a routine of getting up at the same time every day, that's very important. And that'll help you be more productive. So a few other things that you could do when you first start out with a heavy traveling routine. Make sure you update your passport if necessary. You don't want that to expire on you anytime soon. So make sure you keep that up to date because you may need that fairly rapidly. It's a good idea. Sign up for TSA PreCheck. That can save you a lot of time in airports and make it a lot easier for you to get through security no matter where you're traveling. So that's important for you to do that. Go ahead and sign up as soon as you can for airline, hotel, rental car company rewards programs. Make sure they've got your credit card information in there, that they've got your known traveler number for TSA PreCheck, and that just makes things go a whole lot easier for you. Develop a routine for managing your receipts and expenses. And I think it's a good idea to try and do this every week. Don't let your receipts and expenses get behind, because then it becomes a chore to get those completed. Most companies are going to want you to complete those within a certain period of time. So you don't want those things piling up on you. And you also don't want to be submitting a bunch of expenses at the same time, because then your manager is probably going to get mad at you and want you to kind of spread those out. So it's easier to keep up with that stuff as you're going along and not let it get behind. So let's talk about workload requirements for CRAs. First of all, some of you are going to be somewhat familiar with this. If you work in the industry now, you may be familiar with the typical workload for a CRA. If you've read through job listings or you've spoken with people in recruiting in the past, they'll kind of tell you, what the expectation is for the company that they're working for. So it's important to understand a few things. So number one, you're more than likely going to be monitoring more than one study or more than one protocol. Now, if you're lucky and you can get on a large program where you might have more than one protocol, but they're actually part of the same program, they're going to be very similar. So that's a real benefit, because it won't be so foreign to you to switch from one to the other. You're going to be conducting visits at different sites. Some of these sites are going to be sites that you are assigned to as the primary CRA, but in some cases you're going to be monitoring at sites where you're not the primary CRA. So you may be filling in for someone else who's on vacation that week or has some other kind of conflict. So it may be necessary for you to monitor a site where you're not the primary monitor. So it's going to be pretty, what's going to happen is over the course of time, you're going to realize that you've monitored at 30 or 40 different sites, even though only a handful of those sites were specifically assigned to you. Another thing to pay attention to, it's important in your career that you develop expertise in multiple therapeutic areas. Now, that's easier said than done, because sometimes when you first start out, you're going to be just on one study, one protocol in one therapeutic area. So if you can somehow manage to get yourself assigned to a project in another therapeutic area, that just increases your overall marketability. and provides another tool in your toolkit to keep you working. Another thing that's important to do, stay on schedule. Try not to get off schedule. Try not to get out of sync with your study visits, because most of your monitoring plans are going to require that you go back in a regular interval for these monitoring visits. So stay on schedule as much as possible. The other thing, the last thing here, and this is very important, learn to say no. That sounds difficult, but it's very important, because what will happen when you start to get out there and you're working your sites and you're working on a study, these clinical team managers and these project managers are going to come to you and they're going to say, can you conduct a visit, on behalf of this person in this city on this date? And, that's one reason why you want your schedule built out as much as possible, because, if it's going to require you to make some kind of really drastic change to your travel plan, you may have to say no to that, which is perfectly fine. If you're otherwise meeting your required metrics for days on site, which at most CRAs is probably going to be about 8 to 10 per month, then it's perfectly reasonable for you to say no. If you're going to, you're probably not going to take a visit on a day where the day before you were on vacation, because that may require you to travel during your vacation time. It's probably a little bit unreasonable. So learn to say no to some of those things. So it's very important to do that. So let's talk about how you prepare for your visits. And this could be mostly for your IMV visits that you're going to do multiple visits of, but it could apply to any type of visit. First of all, use your monitoring plan. Use the monitoring plan that we talked about in week 3. That's going to be your first tool in helping you prepare for your visits. Secondly, you want to review the last visit report or the last trip report. That's going to tell you what follow-up items are still outstanding that need to be followed up on. It's going to give you some idea, because you may not remember exactly all of these things, particularly if you're going to a site where you didn't perform the last monitoring visit. So you want to review that. What I like to do is to create kind of a site summary that's in Word that I use to help me prepare for the visits. I go through and I see how many follow-up items are still outstanding. I look in the EDC system and see how many CRF pages need to be verified. That's going to determine the workload that's going to be required. I go and look in our eTMF system and see if there's any expired essential documents that I need to follow up on while I'm out at the site. It's important to keep up with things like that. And then finally, learn how to extract data and run reports from your IWRS system, your EDC system, your eTMF system if you're using one. And at the very least, I would run a query report to see if there are any outstanding queries. I would run a listing report out of the EDC system for adverse events, ConMeds, medical history, because you're going to need those reports to help you do your source data verification. Also, as we learned in our IP accountability module, run the IP inventory report. That tells you what IP kits they have on site, which ones have been dispensed, which ones have been returned. You may have to run multiple reports to get all of that, depending on how the IWRS system is set up. And then that way you've got a plan for doing your IP accountability. Also run your subject status report. You can get that out of your IWRS system. That gives you a listing of all the subjects at that site, which ones are screen fails, which ones are currently enrolled, which ones have had recent visits, because that'll show up in the CRF pages that you need to source data verify. So run those reports as well. And it's going to take you a little while, depending on what IWRS system you're using. You're going to have to practice that a little bit to figure out which reports are the most useful, and then go ahead and write those down so that at every visit you can run the same reports, maybe the day before the visit, so they're as accurate as possible. You also want to run a missing or expired documents list out of your ETMS system. That way you know if there's anything you need to collect while you're out there on site. You could have vendor reports that you might need to run, things like lab reports, ECG portals, things like that, that might show you if there are any missing labs, to follow up on those, any missing ECGs that they haven't done, or maybe they did, but they're not in the portal for whatever reason. This gives you an idea of some of the things that you need to keep track of when you go out to the site. So in these next couple slides, I'm going to go over questions that you should be able to answer before you leave for your monitoring visit. And these are very important. So the first question you want to answer to yourself, and this is why you run those reports that I mentioned in the previous slide. You want to know how many CRF pages are there to SDV. If you've got, you can probably SDV anywhere from maybe 60 to 80 to 90 CRF pages in a day. And you're normally going to have a metric for this that's in your monitoring plan, that's in your clinical monitoring plan. So you want to see how many there are out there. If you've got 200 and you've got a 3-day visit schedule, then you can more than likely get through that without too much difficulty. So that's the first question you want to answer. The second question you want to answer, how many open follow-up or action items are there? And then read through them and figure out, are these things, some of these you may be able to close before you go out there, which is great. So if you can do that, then by all means, go ahead and close them. The next question, have any essential documents expired and you need current versions collected? If you need to collect original documents, do you have a shipping label? Do you have a FedEx envelope to put it in? A lot of times sites will have some of those materials, but they're not going to have a shipping label. So if that's something that you create, or if someone else has to create that, it's a good idea to get that done ahead of time, or ask them to create it the day you're there and email it to you. So you can get that done and then slip that in the FedEx box before you leave, or you can ask someone from the site to do it if you're not sure where that is on the site. They can always ship it out for you. Are there any new subjects? How many? If you've got new subjects, you've got to review informed consent. You've got to make sure they're properly registered in the IWRS system, in the data's in the EDC system. So you've got a few other things to do. You've got to check their enrollment eligibility, things like that. So you want to know if they've got new subjects before you go out there. Are there open queries? If they are, take a look at them, see how many they are, see how long they've been open, read through them, see if they're complex, if maybe the sites haven't maybe confused about them. You want to know what that is before you go out there. What issues have occurred since the last visit? One of the things that I like to do, because you may have 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks in between visits, is I just keep a folder online, in your system that's got the investigator name, and it's got a folder for each visit that I'm going to. So if in between visits, if anything comes in, if they send in any documents or anything like that, I copy those into the folder. If there's anything I need to be aware of, I use my summary sheet for that. Copy information there so to check on that when you go back. Are there any staff changes? That requires a lot of work. If they've got changes to staff, they've got to update the delegation log. They may have to issue a new 1572. There are another number of other things that are going to have to occur if they've added staff or if they've removed staff. So it's a good idea to try and know that before you go out there. Have they had any SAEs? Run your AE report. See if they've entered any serious adverse events. Usually you're going to know about these because you're going to get notified probably by the medical monitoring team that they've had an SAE, or the site may notify you directly if one has occurred. So you're normally going to know the answer to that question. But you want to know these before you go out there. So a few other things. Do I have a listing of the IP inventory? Do not go out to a site until you have printed a copy of the IP inventory out of the IWRS system. Don't go out there without it. Make sure you do that. Will I be returning IP during the visit? If that answer to that question is yes, you've got to allow for time to do that. That may take you another hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours to return IP, depending on what the process is for doing that. When you go out on your visit and you're going to be there for, say, 2 days, most sites are going to have limited monitoring time. Maybe they limit it between 8:30 and 4:30 in the afternoon, so you don't have a whole lot of time to get all these things done. So don't wait to discover until you get to the site, oh, by the way, I need to return IP while I'm here. You want to know that ahead of time. Have I spoken to the coordinator by phone? That's very important. You sent a confirmation letter probably a few days before your visit. You've already scheduled the visit, weeks before then, so they know you're on the schedule. And once you have regular sites, it may not be as important to talk to the coordinator before you go out there. But if you're going out there for the first time, definitely talk to the coordinator on the phone a day or two before you go out there. Make sure you know where to park. Make sure you've got directions to the site. They may be hard to find. So ask how easy it is for you to get to the site so that you don't spend a lot of time searching around and have to call them and they have to come get you and things like that. So you want to conduct that conversation over the phone. Don't just rely on email. I'm a big believer in picking up the telephone and talking to people. So make sure you do that before you go out there. So have you confirmed the site's location and address? That's very important, particularly the first time you go out there, because you may have an address that's in a different building than where the site is located. So make sure you verify where you're going and identify any landmarks that you might need to be aware of before you go out there. Do you need any special directions or instructions? Where to park? Do you have to pay to park? Does the parking lot accept credit cards, or do you have to have cash? That's important. You don't want to get out there and discover that it costs you $10 in cash to park and you don't have any cash in your pocket. So make sure you know these things before you go out there. Whenever I go to a site for the first time, I go look on Google Maps and look at what the building looks like so that I can recognize it when I get there. So that's very important. Even if you just do that the night before or even the morning before you leave from the hotel, but do it ahead of time. Do I have the site coordinator's phone number in my phone contacts? Very important. Make sure you put their phone number in your phone so that you can reach them if you need to. At the very least, write their number down on an index card and slip it in your pocket. You don't want to have to get out there and discover, gee, I've got to open up my laptop, get signed in to my company's VPN, look in my clinical trial management system in order to get the coordinator's phone number because I can't find the building that they're in. So make sure you've got that ahead of time before you go out there. Make sure you know what your flight, airline, and flight number is. Very important. I know that sounds very simple, but it's very important because after a while, you're going to get to the point where you're showing up at the airport and you've got to think, what city am I going to? Which airline am I on? Am I on Southwest? Am I on American? Am I on United? Where am I going? I like to write those flight numbers down ahead of time, just on a little index card that I can slip in my pocket. That way I know exactly what the airline is, the flight time, the flight number, all of that. What time is my return flight? Very important. You don't want to get out there and you get all wrapped up in monitoring and you realize, gee, my flight is at 5:10 and it's already almost 4 o'clock. And I've got to drive to the airport, return my rental car, get checked in, and make that flight. So make sure you know when your return flight is. And I like to, ahead of time, discover, find out how far away is the airport. Is it a 20-minute drive? Is it a 30-minute drive? It may be a 20-minute drive at 10:30 a.m. It may be a 40-minute drive at 5 o'clock. So you need to make sure you understand what that is, so you leave yourself enough time to get to the airport. Try not to rush it. I try to leave myself plenty of time because I don't want to miss any flights and not be able to get back on time. What's the distance from the airport to the hotel and to the site? Very important. Depending on where you're staying, your site could be 10, 12, 15 miles away. Hopefully you can stay as close as possible to the site. That's what I recommend. Don't stay close to the airport because you've got plenty of time when you're getting into the city to get from the airport to your hotel because it's going to be the day before. And when you're leaving on your final day, you're leaving from the site to the airport. So you need to know what that distance is so that you allow for enough time to make your flight. So the next thing to talk about is to identify and prioritize the administrative tasks that you have to do. And these include things like, for example, answering email. I try not to let email interfere with my monitoring activities when I'm on site, unless it's something very important that I have to tend to pretty quickly or immediately, which is probably not going to be the case a lot of times. What I tend to do is just tag that email for follow-up later that evening. Then that way I don't miss it. Then in the evening, when I'm back at the hotel and I've had my dinner and I'm kind of sitting around, then I can go kind of answer all those emails kind of at one point. And you're not going to have that many, but you might have a half a dozen or so that fall into that category in a given day. Completing training. Most of your CROs are going to have continual training that you have to do. A good time to do it is when you're in the hotel at night. You've got time, you can kind of sit and think about it and get that stuff knocked out. Writing trip reports, very important. You're going to have to do a trip report for every visit that you do. And usually there's going to be a time frame for getting that in. You may have to submit that within 7 days of your trip report. It's great if you can at least get those started while you're at the site. That's very good. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. But if you can get that tackled the very next day when you get back, that would be good. At least get it started. Even if you have to spend the next couple of days getting it finished up. I like to complete the trip report, kind of let it sit there for a while, maybe go back to it the following day, look through it, make sure I got everything right before I submit it. Completing expense reports. We talked about this earlier. Don't get behind on that. Because what's going to happen, depending on how your expensing system works, you may have a company credit card, and so your expenses kind of get rolled into your expense system, and they show up after a few days of the expense, and then you're going to have to start applying it to the various visits that you're doing. But make sure you're doing that every week. Don't let those things sit around, so now you've got 50 or 60 expense items in there, and you're trying to remember what's what. So kind of stay on top of that. It'll make your life a little easier. Planning future travel, very important. I like to book airline reservations as early as possible. Same with hotel reservations, because as you know, anyone that travels can tell you, every flight you're on these days just about is full. So the better flights fill up quickly. Hotels fill up quickly, especially in the larger cities. So you want to book those as far in advance as you can to make sure you're taking advantage of the best rates and to make sure you're getting the arrangements that you want. You're also going to complete your monitoring letters, your confirmation letter, your follow-up letter. We had a confirmation letter, earlier in our course, so you know what that is. You generally are going to send that anywhere from 1 week to maybe a few days before your visit. Probably doesn't do much good to send it before then. So if you can get it within a week to a couple days, even if you're sending it the day before, that's better. There have been times where I've done visits at the last minute and I just brought the confirmation letter with me. You don't have that very often, but every once in a while you may need to do that. Your follow-up letter is going to be sent out after your trip report is submitted, is approved. You're normally going to have a time frame of when that needs to go out. So make sure you keep up with those time frames because you don't want to get behind on that. Those items are normally a metric that your CRO is going to provide or going to make sure that you adhere to. So make sure you're keeping up with that. Communicating with your team. Make sure you communicate with your team and you stay in contact with them. Email, phone, IM, all of those means of communication are what we're talking about. You're also going to participate in your CRA calls. You're probably going to have at least one every week for each study that you're on. Hopefully they will be on a day when you're in your office, whether your home office or in your company's office. That'll be a lot better because you can talk a little more freely on those. And, if they occur on dates where you're on site, then, that kind of eats into your monitoring time that you've got available for that site. And you also don't want them to occur at a time where you're traveling, where you're kind of not in contact with anyone. But that does happen on occasion. If you are traveling during one of those calls, let your clinical team manager or your project manager know, hey, by the way, I'm going to be traveling during this call. I won't be on it. They'll make a recording. You can listen to it later. So make sure you're keeping up with those things. So our readings for this week include Appendix B from your textbook, which is hints and tips. I think you'll see that what's in there kind of amplifies many of the things that I've talked about here. I've also got an online article for you to read called Flying Blind on CRA Workload and Time Demands. I think you'll like that. There's an interesting article that I've posted on the Moodle for you called A Day in the Life of a Monitor. I think you'll get a good feel for that. And then finally, there's an online article, Can CROs Take the Sting Out of CRA Travel? All these articles are fairly short, but they amplify many of the things that I've gone over in this lecture. So I think you'll get a lot out of them. Then finally, on your online assignment for this week, I've got a nice little real-world problem for you to solve. So essentially, you've been given sites in the following cities to conduct a one-day monitoring visit. These cities include Bastrop, Louisiana, Miami, Florida, Hialeah, Florida, Little Rock, Arkansas, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Decatur, Georgia, Peoria, Arizona, Tucson, Arizona, and Jackson, Tennessee. So you've been asked to complete these visits in a 5-week period. So think about that for a moment. That's a lot of cities in a fairly short period of time. And they're spread from coast to coast. Discuss how you would plan and schedule these visits to maximize your time on site while minimizing travel time. So this is going to require you to think a little bit. You're going to have to get your map out, see where these places are, that type of thing, and kind of develop a schedule. You want to spend the least amount of time traveling and the most amount of time available on site, and not kill yourself traveling back and forth from these cities. So think about that. I want you to post your assessment in this week's discussion forum. So I think you'll find this exercise to be interesting. It'll kind of get you thinking a little bit about what's involved in all of this. And I'll be looking forward to see what you come up with out on the discussion forum. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you out there this week.